Video games based on TV shows, very much like games based on films, often get a bad rap. You'll often see a hit TV show and then quickly games companies are scrambling for the rights to make games off the back of it. They often try to put out games as soon as possible because they're running the risk that if the show's popularity dies off, then they'll be left with an expensive set of rights they have no hope of ever seeing a return on. Like many other consoles in history, the Nintendo 64 has its fair share of games based off TV shows. From the popular franchises like South Park, all the way to the weird and wonderful ones like Bassmasters. For today's list, I wanted to look at 5 Nintendo 64 games based off TV shows. For this list, I'm excluding cartoon or animated TV shows because, they'll get covered eventually, and also Elmo's 2 Sesame Street N64 games because let's face it, I'd rather drink piss than have to play either of those 2 N64 games ever again. As always, if you want a full review of any of the games featured in today's episode, then head on down to the description box where I'll link you up to full reviews. And for today's topic of conversation in the comments section, I'd love to know which TV show you felt didn't get a game worthy of how good the TV show was. For me, it was probably Lost because I loved that show, and the game called Via Domus was interesting but ultimately didn't live up to how damn fun the show was. But enough of that, let's get on to the games. We're only minutes into this video and already you're quickly jumping into the comment section to kick off. But Glenn, Mission Impossible is a movie and the game is based off the first Mission Impossible movie with Tom Cruise. Well bless you Clive, you're wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. Everyone go to the comments and tell Clive he's wrong. Mission Impossible is a 1998 game developed by Infogrames and published by Ocean Software. The game went through absolute hell in development, partly because the studio overestimated how powerful the console would be and then had to scramble to cut back on all the promises that they'd made about the game to the press. It also doesn't help that it was originally planned to be a PC game, and so announcing a console version was clearly a disaster for the studio. But we're not here to talk about development hell today, we're here to talk about games based on TV shows, and this is where things get a bit messy. Tom Cruise acquired the rights to the franchise through his own production company and went about rebooting the series. Although this time he felt that instead of a new TV show, he would himself star as Ethan Hunt and take the franchise to the silver screen. The game, however, is a weird one. Technically is based and is styled more in line with the old 1960s TV series, which I actually love seeing repeats of even as a kid back in the 80s. They did however implement some key scenes from the movie to help broaden the game's appeal, which is why you'll always see someone showing off the ceiling ascent scene with lasers all over the place. That is why I think many people think the game is based off the movie, when in actual fact there's more scenes from the long-running TV series which can be linked here. Also of interest, and I mentioned more of this in the full review I did of this game, but Tom Cruise refused to allow the developers to use his likeness, due to being able to kill people in the game and his wish to disassociate himself from video game violence. Sadly, that was just the start of how weird he would become. Weird cults being pushed to one side, the game is a guilty pleasure for me. It got pretty poor reviews, was years late, and from the very first level you can sense just how much they had cut out of the game. At the same time though, it does have some fantastic moments, and the implementation of gadgets was second to none. The cutscenes and voice acting intros are well done, and they do a great job of making it feel like the TV show. When GameTech ran out of money whilst making the incredibly ambitious Robotech 64, they instead took on work to produce 2 games based on TV licenses, both of which will be featured in this video. Starting with perhaps the more popular one, Wheel of Fortune takes everyone's favourite wheel-spinning TV show and gives it the 64-bit makeover. And by makeover, I mean rough graphics, characters that look like they've been cut out of a 1990s clothing catalogue, and sound that's so hard on your ears. But it's Wheel of Fortune, and at its core it's a fun game which you can play with friends, and it has a decent amount of puzzles to keep it feeling fresh. A big plus was all of the voice work by the hosts and also the full motion video clips. For its time, you've got to remember that you rarely saw full motion video on the console, and so this showed that it was possible despite it being heavily compressed. The studio did a good job of getting the presentation just right, and it's hard not to say they did a good job because you've got to imagine the disappointment the creative team must have felt. One minute they're working on the console's most ambitious and perhaps most anticipated game at that time, to the next day working on a game which they knew would most likely only ever be sold to rental stores. Overall, it's a play once kind of game. Experience it for a few games in and then you'll never want to go back to it, unless you've got a curious friend over or you're dusting off your Nintendo 64 for Christmas and your parents want something that they can play with you. Xena Warrior Princess Talisman of Fate is a 3D arena style fighting game which often gets forgotten about or overlooked. Based off the TV series Xena Warrior Princess, you choose from one of the many familiar faces from the TV show and duke it out on 3D stages. What makes the game so interesting is that whilst it's limited in its combos and special moves, it allows up to 4 player simultaneous gameplay, so you can play it with 3 friends at the same time, or even go solo and play through the campaign, which is sprinkled with handicap matches to really test your might. If you see Titus on the box, don't be worried. This is one of the games which they published but was actually developed by Sapphire. They did a solid job picking the popular characters, and whilst the animations are not perfect, you do feel a sense of unique styles when playing as every character. The stages you fight on too are also taken from the TV show, and whilst they look fairly good, they have been intentionally limited to allow for the 4-player mode to run so smoothly as it does without slowdown hammering the console's hardware. It's hard not to find some enjoyment in the game. Fans of the TV show will love seeing all of their popular characters, and the only thing I think they could criticise is the fact that they'd have liked perhaps a story mode which delved further into the characters, or created a whole new entire story and linked it in with why you're basically battling one another. Look, I'm not a Xena fan myself, as I've only seen the show a few times and it wasn't really for me, but I think this franchise is just screaming out for a new game, with either a Streets of Rage style beat 'em up game, or if we're going into dream game territory here, I think an open world fantasy adventure game would have been superb. Still though, for its time, it's an enjoyable game which both fans and non-fans can enjoy. Jeopardy is another game tech game they churned out whilst trying to keep afloat after Robotech 64 became a cash sinkhole for the company. Like Wheel of Fortune, it's directly linked to the game show itself and also has full motion video, some heavily compressed voice work, and graphics that would make the Super Nintendo blush. Look, if you like Jeopardy, which I don't, then you might like this game. The questions are very tough and they're heavily linked to American audiences, which makes playing it as a very European person more difficult, including some answers using American spellings, which further complicates it. It's cheap to pick up, it doesn't have the nostalgic charm that Wheel of Fortune has, and yet when playing the game you can reminisce about what would have happened if everyone had gone out and bought this game to help refill the coffers over at GameTech, which would have allowed Robotech 64 to get completed. I'm sure you can tell by now that I'm still quite bitter that we didn't get Robotech 64, but if you want to know more about that, then head over to my N64 Beta Project episode where I spill the beans on what went down with Robotech 64. Hercules is a third-person action-adventure game with some minor RPG-like elements. As the name suggests, this one is based off the TV show featuring everyone's favourite person, Kevin Sorbo, before he went a little bit strange. It packs in some of the more popular characters from the show, and so the level of fan service here is adequate, but I'd say this is the type of game which Xena Warrior Princess should have been more suited to. Like the show, the game isn't set in a specific time period, but it's more set up as being an historical fantasy period in Greek mythology, but there's also some Egyptian and medieval elements thrown in. The storyline makes sense here, and although the combat isn't perfect, it's simplistic enough to let most people play it without any problems. The levels are huge, and although there is some backtracking later in the game, for the most part it's a fairly linear adventure where you'll get to play as key characters at certain times in the game who each have their own unique abilities and skills. Hercules may have been the favourite son of Zeus, but Hercules the game will be nobody's favourite N64 game. Up against some much stronger games of a similar ilk, this one just gets pushed to the wayside. I think fans of the show would rate this one more highly given its close ties to the TV show, but for casual fans it's likely to only be a game which you play after completing some of the more developed adventure games like Zelda and Shadow Man. Bonus game time here with Fire Electric Pen. This Japanese exclusive game was based off a hit Japanese TV show of the late 90s. You must choose one of the many courses which range in difficulty, and they get insanely hard by the end. I like to think of this game as either a rage-inducing coma simulator or a way to test how much damage Mario Party has done to your analog sticks, because the aim for the game is to guide your stick through the courses to reach the finish line. This sounds simple, and yes, we've all played this type of game in real life perhaps before. Heck, I even remember having to make one of these as part of a primary school electronics class, and so the game itself is old, but it's a cool modern twist to it. The game is weird, it's fun, stressful, and the Japanese bloke shouting at you whilst you're playing is hilarious, as it's about as close to the show as you can realistically get with this type of game. Funnily enough though, the high sales of this game in Japan were actually responsible for the show's ratings creeping up, and so it's a rare instance of a game helping views of a show rather than the show helping sales of the game. So there you have it, there's a Birmingham handful of games based on TV shows. Which one was your favourite? How would you have used any of the licenses for these games to make a different style of game? As always, sound off in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, and until next time.